Councilmember Cormack.
Here.
Chair Du Bois.
Here.
Vice Mayor Fine.
Here.
3 present.
Okay, so this is the finance meeting of October 1st. And I guess we have one speaker for oral communications, which is Steve Levy.
As you know, I've been writing a series of memos, mostly to staff, to encourage staff to ask the consultant to try and resolve some of the data issues that my experience tells me that will come to you, and also to you all to try and focus on what I think are some of the choices you're going to have to make that are foundational to getting any credible estimates of yield of the taxes. I do this partly because that's what I do for a living, and I'm hoping it can be helpful in the city in which I live. But I also hope at the end to be able to support a business tax. This is not a preparation for coming back and saying you didn't do this, you didn't do this, and you didn't do this. I know tonight is polling, but I think fairly soon the committee for the council really has to decide on the exemptions and on the rates so that the consultant can at least give you credible estimates. You can ask for a range under different assumptions, but I'm not understanding exactly how the polling is going to work unless you can tell people, well, if we do this, it would yield this, and if we do this, it would yield that. A couple of other points. I think it would be helpful for staff to ask the consultant not only to look at East Palo Alto and San Francisco, but to look at the other cities, Mountain View and Sunnyvale and Cupertino and now San Jose, that have been either implementing or struggling with how to implement a business tax, both to find out how they did it, how they got the data, how they struggled with the exemption issue, how they made it work administratively. And then you're going to hear from stakeholders. I think you have a letter in the packet from Tiffany on the issue of competitiveness, and I don't want to advise you on that, but I think it would be helpful, given that you're going to get a barrage of conflicting opinions, if there's any way that the staff can get someone maybe from Stanford to really give you a briefing on tax incidents and how that might or might not affect competitiveness. The other thing that will affect my decision as a resident is how you handle the equity criteria that staff gave you in the very first memo. You've got industries where the average pay is like 30 to 40,000. You got industries where the average pay is 250,000. They would seem to be different for me. The last thing, and we've been struggling. I've been struggling to get a list of the 10 top employers that I think is credible, but I do think probably the top 2 are Children's Hospital and the VA. I'm pretty sure we don't have anything like Apple or Facebook or Google or Adobe or any of the stuff in San Francisco. They've got 5,000 or 8,000 or 10,000 employees, and I don't know how that will affect you going forward, but I'm hoping the staff can come back before the next meeting and give you a real sense of the number of firms by size class, so you can get a sense for how different our landscape here is. I'm going to go watch baseball. I hope the polling consultant and you work out some interesting things. I am so grateful that the staff didn't take an hour for a presentation.
Is that the A's tonight?
But
Yeah. All right, well, thank you, Steve. So we'll move on to action item number 1, our one and only item, which is the work plan for a potential business tax. Presentation at all?
So there is not a staff presentation tonight. Really, before the committee is just the revised work plan based on the direction that the council had provided staff on September 16th. And we also have brought Dave Metz from FM3, who has historically helped the city with the various polling polls, frankly, since probably, 2008? All the way back to the original business tax, plus the bond measure, plus the business tax trial in 2016, as well as the TOT polling that was done in 2018. So he's really here to help facilitate and answer any questions about what polling can do to help the committee as well as the council inform their process and where we're at currently. I do have one amendment to the staff report. Upon further review, looking at the Finance Committee's role in this whole revenue generating ballot measure endeavor, the Finance Committee is intended to assist and review, staff work, consultant work, stakeholder feedback, and make its recommendations for consideration by the full 7-member City Council. And so one step that is omitted in the work plan in October is that step in terms of Finance Committee providing further work and next steps specifically around what the initial polling and stakeholder outreach might look like. Staff would recommend that we return to the Finance Committee at the second October meeting based on tonight's conversation with a straw man for the committee then to forward to the full council for their consideration and direction prior to any work being completed on a initial poll. And then that, I believe, will still, although tight, be able to allow us to conform to still trying to have results by the December timeframe from an initial polling time perspective. And it will meet the original intent of the Finance Committee's role and provide the City Council during the month of October review/approval of what the Finance Committee recommends for that next step.
Can you just clarify that, because it says complete the poll in October? So wouldn't we be falling behind schedule?
The ultimate goal from a polling perspective would be that it works during the October timeframe, and you are correct that we would need to continue outreach and polling during November 19 under staff work. I still think that even if we were to receive direction from the full council by the end of October, that we'd be able to present results to the full council sometime in December.
Got it.
And if I could just build on that, the expectation at your next meeting of this committee would not be another lengthy conversation on this topic. We would be bringing you a proposal to forward to full council, and we would be seeking any tight refinement of that. But we've got other topics that we know you want to cover on that agenda, so we would just be bringing it forward as a summary of what you've already talked about tonight.
I thought we'd also be getting a lot of the data that we don't have in that November meeting, right, from EDD and.
Correct, and in my mind, those are two separate tracks.
Okay, but we would be having an in-depth discussion on that stuff.
We would be having further conversations about the refined, so I guess let me look at the council action. The item A and B within the council's, what I summarized the council action, which was further analysis on what a potential headcount, payroll, square footage would be structured with the exemptions. That is on a parallel track with our other consultant matrix, and staff still intends to bring that back during the November timeframe. But depending on what's in the initial poll, that would obviously limit some of it to the extent we didn't have some of the data. However, I suspect in terms of what an initial poll would glean based on the at places in front of you, we might be able to work around that gap in data for the initial polling, if that's the will of the council. We could also wait till we have that data, but just realize that the polling wouldn't occur until probably December timeframe during the holidays, which might not be the best timeframe. And then we would return probably January, February.
Okay, so we do have two public speakers, so why don't we go there? So the first one's Tiffany Grego, second one's Dan Kostenbacher.
Good evening. My name's Tiffany Griego, Managing Director of Stanford Research Park. And I wanted to say to Steve before he left, I'm just really grateful we have somebody so wise in our city to raise really important questions that I think challenge us to do our homework. I just wanted to share with you some of the questions that I've been fielding from Research Park companies that have been kind of held in in time until we hear further information, both from the polling and from you, about the direction things are going, and before these companies can form opinions about where they're going to fall on these proposed taxes. Those questions include, would the proposed tax be a general tax or a special tax? And if a general tax, how would the city ensure the most responsible use of funds? We'd like to encourage the city to consider how to structure a tax to facilitate transparency and oversight by the public, and to demonstrate a most effective return on investment to the community. And we'd like to encourage continuing to define community as broadly as possible and include the business community in that. We're, of course, curious, what will the proposed tax amount be, and what will the structure be, and how will this compare to the cities we feel we compete with, which is Mountain View, Sunnyvale, and Cupertino. Often companies that are looking to settle in the research park are looking at those specific jurisdictions. And so we'd like to encourage the city to assess the long-term consequences of levying a tax that exceeds the immediate adjacent neighboring cities, if indeed that's the direction we are going. And I believe some of the dollar amounts that have been discussed to date have exceeded Mountain View, for example. Would the proposed tax discourage startups from locating in Palo Alto, especially startups that fall into the life science category? I wanted to share with you that we've decided to deliberately work to recruit life science companies to Stanford Research Park and back to Palo Alto. During the 1990s, we were the place to be. Palo Alto was the place to be for life science companies. But now that Merck is departing, we've basically seen nearly all of our life science companies leave Palo Alto for greener pastures and a more business-friendly climate in Mission Bay and South San Francisco. So since Stanford University is going the direction of supporting life science from a basic research standpoint, we also would like to walk in lockstep and benefit from that strategy in the research park. Well, life science companies bring with them a series of different challenges. They're often not profitable for a very long period of time. And I think a lot of these taxes that are being proposed would be taxes on top line revenue. And so we just wanted to make sure we push the topic and of inquiry as to how would this perhaps dissuade life science companies that would not see profitability for years to come. How would this impact them and their appetite to come here? We're also worried that there might be a regressive effect on startups in general. And let's see. We also are frankly concerned about taxes impacting larger scale companies, and that's because we've successfully secured buy-in to our Transportation Management Association programs by large companies that are voluntarily and privately funding our efforts to reduce traffic congestion. Jamie Jarvis and I are very excited to come speak with you next Monday about the quite frankly, significant impact we've been having on reducing traffic congestion, and we don't want to undermine the enthusiasm or the private funding source. We would like to discuss some version of credit against the tax revenue if companies continue to support these programs electively. Was that a beep for me, by the way?
Yeah.
Well, that's unfortunate. Let's work together to get this right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tiffany. And our last speaker is Dan Kostenbader.
Yeah, hi, thank you, members of the Finance Committee. Dan Kostenbader with the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. I'm Vice President for Tax Policy. I made a comment at the council meeting on September 16th, and I'm not sure it was necessarily interpreted the way I was trying to make the point, and that was that we've got the split roll measure on the November 2020 ballot, definitely, and we may have the faster 1% sales tax on the ballot as well. And my sense from hearing the conversation may have been a thought that that was sort of a political analysis, that if you have too many tax measures on a ballot, you know, it's hard to pass them. I was not making that point. It may or may not be true. You ought to be taken into account. But my point was that if those two taxes are on the ballot and they both pass, a couple of things are going to happen. Number one, a lot of Palo Alto businesses that have the ownership of their property for a longer period of time will have experienced tremendous appreciation. So they're going to have, in addition to whatever you might do with a business tax, they're going to have a very large tax increase. And for smaller businesses that may be renting from, you know, larger companies, larger properties, they're going to have a triple net lease, so the small businesses will end up making those payments. And beyond the two that I mentioned, there's now a lot more discussion possibly about a tax on business services at a state level. I've also read that the Palo Alto School District is thinking about a tax. And then statewide, the school boards are thinking about perhaps another tax. So, you know, we may see multiple tax increases on Palo Alto businesses before there's a Palo Alto business tax. So I really encourage you to take that into account, particularly with Faster. You know, we don't know exactly how the money's going to be spent, but certainly grade separation could be, you know, part of their agenda for a really top flight infrastructure around the Bay. And then split roll, Palo Alto, the city, is going to get a significant tax benefit, tax increase if that were to pass in the November ballot. So you may be getting a lot more tax revenue, and then perhaps with Faster a lot more spending relief than you're currently considering. So I think these really ought to be taken into consideration before, you know, adding more taxes to Palo Alto businesses through just the business tax that you're considering. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll come back to council. I think so tonight it's kind of a discussion of the work plan. I think as much as we can frame up items C, E, and F to advance things, the better. So stakeholder engagement, kind of a first level of polling, and probably as part of the polling, talking about how revenue would be allocated to various programs. Because we did several polls fairly recently, I think it probably makes sense to start with, I'm sorry, what's his name again? Dave. So I don't know if you, welcome, and
Thank you very much. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Dave Metz with FM3 Research. And I think having reviewed the direction from council and had some conversations with staff, our sense is that the best way to approach this is probably to think about a sequence of 2 polls, which is the same methodology we applied in both 2016 and 2018 when you were looking at measures for the November ballots in those years. The first poll, which in 2018 we labeled the exploratory poll, would basically be designed to explore the building blocks that would be part of any revenue measure, all of the different choices before you. Do you have a tax that's based on payroll, on square footage, on head count? What are the rates? Are there exemptions for certain businesses? For what duration should it be in place? Should it be general or specific? If specific, which services should the money be dedicated to fund? All of those different elements, obviously there's numerous permutations that could be put together. And so the goal of the first poll would be to identify which of those structural elements make a difference to voters, if there's any places where they draw sharp distinctions in terms of the kinds of measures they'd be willing to support. And then we could come back to you and make some recommendations about how we think a whole could be constructed, which is equal to or greater than the sum of those parts. A second survey, pending further direction from the council, would then test a fully developed model, or perhaps 2 or 3 models of what a ballot measure might look like, and would test the feasibility of those measures in a more rigorous fashion, drafting a model 75-word ballot question, providing a detailed explanation of how the measure is structured, and then testing a series of pro and con arguments to replicate the kind of public debate that would happen and see whether the measure has durable enough support over the required threshold to be successful. So that sequence of 2 polls obviously would run parallel to all the other policy development work the council would be doing and the data you'd be getting from other consultants over the same period of time, ideally to sort of arrive at a point where end of this year, early next, you'd be in a position to make a decision about whether to move forward.
And I don't know if you have this packet with past polls. Would it be worth kind of walking us through some of these, not page by page, but
Sure.
fairly quickly?
So I think if you look at the 2016 polls, the first one, which is dated in April of 2016, sort of follows this exploratory poll model. You'll see there's a number of different questions that we've asked about people's perceptions of Palo Alto in just about every poll we've done since 2008. What are the major issues facing the city? How do you feel about city government? Do you feel like there's a need for additional revenue to fund city services? I think it'll be worth repeating a number of those questions just so you can understand how the sort of context among the voters may be the same or different from what you faced in previous years. Then we have a section here where we tested a variety of different business tax models to fund transportation in this case, starting with on page 7, slide 9 of that early 2016 poll. And you'll see we weren't testing specific ballot language here, but giving people general conceptual descriptions of what a measure might entail. We did test a little messaging in this early poll. You'll see that starting on slide 17 on page 11, and a list of the pro and con messages we tested and the degree to which support for a measure was fluid. But more of our time and effort was spent on looking at the structural elements of a measure, and that begins on slide 25 on page 15. You'll see we asked about a variety of different exemptions. We talked about dedicating the funding to transportation, how voters would react to that, and then went through a variety of different specific projects that might be funded by the measure and had voters rate the importance of those projects. All of that then, along with other council direction, fed into the ballot measure that we ended up testing in, or ballot measure options that we tested in a little bit more specific form in the June 2016 poll, which you'll see starting on page 21. So I think the range of options that you're considering may be a little bit different this time around, but the basic structure of that two-poll sequence would be pretty similar. And we've done that, I think, even back in 08, like when we were looking at the library polling, we did multiple polls following that same sort of model, trying to understand broadly where the public was and then use that to develop a specific proposed measure and test it more rigorously.
The other thing I recall from that was the focus groups. And I think those helped dramatically in terms of understanding the opposition and favorable messaging. So that I recall being something that was beneficial as we thought about that. It was an addition to the poll.
That's right. So when we were looking at the library measure in 2008, we convened two focus groups with local voters. These are 2-hour moderated discussions with 8 to 10 people, where we, instead of asking them a series of very specific, closed-ended questions the way we do in a poll, we had a very open-ended conversation. Asked them, what we're talking about libraries there, what they valued about it, what they thought needed to be improved. Got their reactions to a variety of different ways of sort of putting the pieces together and articulating the pros and cons of what was being put forward. And that is a very helpful complement. It allows you to uncover things you may not think of in advance, and is, thoughtful and open-minded as we all try to be. Obviously, there's perspectives that residents have that we won't have considered, and focus groups can help to surface that. Ideally, if you did that after the first poll and before the second, it would mean you could sort of take the value of what you learned from those focus groups and really test it more rigorously in the second poll. We'd have to look at the timeline and budget, obviously, to see what's doable. But
Including with the language, the ballot language,
That's
I
right.
remember it being particularly helpful.
That's right.
Are we jumping in? Or-
So is the small business summary survey, is that also something you did? No. So why don't we talk about the business outreach piece before we start the discussion?
Sure. So what staff printed out was the business outreach that was done in 2016. That was done by a separate firm, TBWB. And what they did was survey businesses, and they were individual meetings to allow for, frankly, individual perspectives. And then they summarized them I think it begins on page 33. In terms of the responses that they received and feedback that was received from them. So this would be separate probably from the specific polling, because these are not necessarily voters. FM3 would be looking at voters' perspectives and where voters may land on an issue, language, priorities. This one was specific to the business community and their responses to these specific questions. And so we could do something similar, obviously, in parallel to the voter polling activities.
Do you know how those businesses were selected, or was it sort of volunteer? The list was in there, and it was interesting. I recognized a fair number of them. I think it's worth doing. I'd like us to consider doing it in a pretty thoughtful manner. I think we talked a time before about having, some larger businesses, some smaller, in a variety of industry. So it wasn't apparent from that. I'm sure staff would look at that carefully, but sort of a thoughtful approach to what sorts of businesses should
Correct.
be included.
And, especially since TBWB is the firm that did this previously, if we were to contract with them specifically again, we would potentially be able to leverage the experience and lessons learned from that. And I cannot answer how we chose the firms back then.
Well, I thought what was interesting is, the responses were really quite consistent about improving traffic flow. It was just, I didn't do the numbers, but it was like 3 out of 4 of them were across the way were like, this is worth doing if we can. There were a few in there that were quite strongly worded. But in general, I thought that was helpful.
And I can't quite remember why we did medium and small, but we didn't do large.
Not
I
specifically.
think this was more about the downtown TMA at the time, I think.
Well, on page 44 are the medium and large business
Right.
survey responses.
Oh,
So,
it's mostly medium, I thought. Oh, you're right, medium/large.
yeah, so page 44 through 48.
Yeah, just looking at the businesses, it seems to be more medium than large. So, I guess I'll look to you guys about how we want to structure the discussion. Do we want to actually just kind of work through the items and maybe start with stakeholder engagement, which is C?
Yeah, our C, E, and F, is that what you're looking for from us tonight?
I was gonna say, so part of this is confirming that this work plan that's before you tonight is in alignment with, kind of the execution of the council direction back in September, all of 2 weeks ago. Sorry, it feels like a lot longer than that. With that one amendment, as I mentioned, of, coming back to the finance committee in October as well as full council in October to get that direction. The second piece is to actually really think through the timeframe, to the extent, as you just heard from Mr. Metz, as well as the outreach piece that Councilmember Cormack just mentioned. Would we want those on the same timeframe? Would we want the potentially outreach side from a business perspective take a longer timeframe than what's proposed? Right now, it's proposed that we would really try and strike with everything between now and the December timeframe, but perhaps I will say doing these individual outreaches to businesses is more time intensive and costly, frankly. And from the timing perspective, would we want to change how staff has outlined it from a workflow perspective? Would we potentially want to do polling first, then work on outreach, let that polling inform some of the outreach, let things drag on into the new year? One piece of information to just add for the committee's awareness, I know that parallel to this, so not this process, obviously, we've divorced the process of a potential ballot measure and grade separation and the XCAP work, but just for situational awareness for the committee, I believe that staff is working on a revised timeframe for the XCAP based on the new direction, and my suspicion is they won't be ready for things like polling for grade separation until the new year. So if that's helpful to the committee in formulating the timing of things, and if we want any synergies amongst poll 1 versus poll 2, focus groups, and or outreach to the business community from an XCAP and radial perspective, that we probably won't be hearing from that externally until January. I believe staff is pulling together a staff report to be heard this fall on what that actual outreach plan would look like. So I think that's what staff's looking for, is this the direction we want to go? Obviously, there are costs associated with all of these things that are not budgeted, so in the resource impact section, staff's made their best guess as to what the cost of polling as well as outreach would be, but depending on the scope, we would need to revise those, bring that back to the full council, and actually get budget authority and potentially contract authority should those contracts exceed $85,000. And depending on, again, scope, they very well may.
Okay.
So just looking at this, I think overall this work plan is roughly right, but I think we have a bit of prioritization to do in adding some structure, meat to the bones before we actually go out with a few of the functions here, primarily polling, stakeholder engagement. I just get a little worried when I see, we've got like 3 or 4 different types of taxes, a range of figures. We haven't really discussed exemptions much. We kind of just brainstormed a couple, but I don't think we've actually gone into that. We don't really know about like tiering, or are we going to have, a phase-in period? And I think we could give this a little more structure.
I kind of see that, yeah, it's kind
Before
of a
we-
goal tonight. So we think
Well-
about some structure, send that back to the council. And that's why I thought maybe if we approach these one at a time and we started with the business engagement, we could start to say kind of
Well,
what are the things we want to test. And then thinking about kind of a two-phased approach with maybe exploratory.
no, I think the two-phase
Yeah.
approach is totally valid and seems like it'll be helpful. I just worry if we're able to give direction on that tonight, even just like the exemptions, right? We have a short list here of, retail, restaurants, hospitality, medical industries. I mean, I actually don't know the range of choices we even have there, right?
Yeah, and I think.
And same thing about like tiering.
Are we permitted to discuss exemptions?
I'm not sure.
I believe we are permitted in the sense of talking about broad categories.
Okay, just checking.
When we start to refine further, then we may need to
Sure.
revisit that.
So even those broad categories, I'm not sure we're quite aware of them, and that's what I'm getting at. And so I hear staff when they say, the business engagement may be longer tail than the polling actually. That's interesting and helpful to hear. I think that's something we should begin spinning up, but you also don't want to go to these business stakeholders and say, hey, we're considering, a $1 to $20 million tax. It could be these 4 different types. We have no clue what the exemptions are. What do you guys think? I just don't see that being a terribly helpful discussion. And so,
So when
And
will,
it's-
when will we have
Yeah.
data that will help us pick a few scenarios to
Right.
share with everyone?
exactly. And I think that's kind of a bit of a goal.
That's
We-
maybe the question I have about the
Yeah.
work.
Do we have 2 or 3 kind of preferences that we can just kind of eyeball tonight?
Yeah, so again, our next meeting, I guess, we're gonna talk about, well, the November meeting, we'll have some data. But I think we should talk about, again, when you look at these polling questions, I don't think we need a lot of answers to start to ask about some of these categories from an exploratory viewpoint. And that's why I think it's actually very helpful to look at these recent polls, as well as, I think the survey was a little different focus of the business outreach, but it's also kind of a format. And, if you look at the calendar, I think we can make some recommendations to council in terms of starting the outreach, starting the polling. We're gonna get the data, in the schedule, and we will talk about A, B, and D in November, which is where we really start to focus in on types of taxes. And then hopefully that stuff would come together kind of the December timeframe, which would tee us up well for a second round of polling, actually getting into real details. So I guess I'd like to propose some structure. I think there's a danger here, we could just circle around. Why don't we start with C, which is the outreach, and kind of see how that goes, and then we can go to E and F.
Can I ask a question about A first? When I recall a discussion we had here, I thought we were talking about a parcel tax on commercial square footage. Is that right, or was, what? I remember our discussion being about commercial square footage, and in all of these, it just says, it's just a parcel tax on square footage.
You are correct. All of our discussions have been around commercial. I don't think in the specific motion we said commercial, which is why it's not in here.
Okay.
But yes, that's,
We
been the
should try to
focus.
be more clear, and you can help us do that next time? Okay, that was just a
Yes.
question I had. Okay, now, you wanna go to C?
Yeah.
And if it's helpful, in terms of what staff's looking for, we we're not trying to bog you all down into like co-creating the entire work plan with staff, right? But getting some guiding principles, your must-haves or can't-stands, and the outcomes you're looking for, and then we can take that and go figure out how to get there as we flesh out the work plan, if that helps.
And you would flesh that out and then bring it to council, and then, I guess at that level, right?
Yes and no. From a work plan perspective, I think the fleshing it out and giving kind of some signposts or guideposts for staff is helpful just at the committee level, in the sense of making sure we're not spinning our wheels in terms of report production every 2 weeks on this item. And then I would say more specifically, if we want to actually take action on something, for example, we want to move forward with an initial poll, more specifics would be helpful, because that's what we would bring to full council for them to then confirm that direction from the committee. So it would be Finance Committee's recommendation as to a path forward. Council's motion specifically lines out all these items and says, go forth, staff, do these things. And so what we're trying to do is harken back to the roles of the committee versus the council as we move forward, and try and manage the asks of the council while meeting the demands of the timeframes.
So without bringing the entire work plan to the council, we would bring the products of the work plan to the council.
Correct.
So I'll try to hear a little bit to the chair's suggestion of focusing on some of these letters. Although I do like Councilmember Cormack's suggestion of maybe like scenarios. Maybe we choose 3 that we're going to go and talk about. So in letter C, next steps on stakeholder engagement with businesses. Looking over this report, it was helpful. This at places today. I do think it was a bit narrow, just saying 0 to 10 and 10 and above. So I'd love a little more granularity there among businesses. I'm not quite sure how to treat exemptions. Do we exempt those people from the focus groups? My gut tells me no, that you probably want to include just the business community at large. I did think there was a good range of businesses in there. Some I recognized, some I didn't. Some bigger, some smaller. But we probably want a sample that's somewhat representative of Palo Alto, and I guess I can leave that up to staff a bit. I think it should also be ongoing, right? Because like in my ideal of this process, eventually, if we go forward with this, we do want, businesses to come out and say, hey, thank you for involving us. We have some qualms about this, but we mostly support it. And that would be kind of the ideal situation. I think that helps the passage of this and the acceptance of it by the community and businesses too. That's a few thoughts on stakeholder engagement.
We on C?
Yep.
Okay. I'm grateful to Ms. Griego for her helpful questions, and I think some will be addressed in the poll, and I think some are, things that we just don't have the answers to yet. And some are things that we haven't contemplated. For example, if we think about Mr. Levy's questions, it's kind of related to, the economic impacts, and I think that's worth us contemplating. I don't quite see it in the work plan or know exactly how we would structure that, but I'll just set that out there for people to consider. Point of sale, I don't know that we've really been given a great description. If we have, perhaps I don't recall it, of how much of that business-to-business sales tax happens where, and if that's at all related. I'm just looking at her question on the second page. So I think these questions are, maybe we have, now I'm brainstorming, might or might not be a good idea. Maybe we have, an evening where it's specifically designed around questions. I guess that's what we're doing now. Okay, never mind. I think the small groups look like they generated a reasonable amount of specific information. So as long as they're selected, thoughtfully, I suggest we do that again. I'm open to other suggestions, but that seemed like it generated the level of information that was helpful now looking back at it.
Yeah. So for me, I think was it TVWB? Is that the name of the company? I think the outreach looked good. I think kind of a similar structure of one-on-one interviews. I think I agree with Councilmember Fine about maybe more granularity in terms of small, medium, large. I think asking them about ease of compliance with the different types of tax would be useful. I also think, I mean, I can imagine if we ask them about some kind of phase-in period, I'm sure longer is better, but maybe we can ask some questions about that. And then I think exemptions similar to what was in the previous poll about small businesses. We asked about retail and restaurants previously. I think this committee was also interested in including hotels. And so basically asking them how they feel about exemptions.
Maybe if we just structure that slightly more broadly and say, like, are there impacts on certain industries that, we should be aware of? So that we surface any that we might not know of?
In addition, sure.
Yeah.
But I think if we're contemplating, exemptions for small nonprofits, I mean, similar to the polling that was done before, it would be good just to talk to them about that. But I think if, staff comes back with some proposal to council that kind of encompasses that feedback. If I understood Councilmember Fine, were you suggesting that we phase this outreach as well?
Well, I just heard from staff that this business outreach may be longer and harder to kick off than the polling, right? That we have more of a mechanism to do the polling, and that doing, whether it's focus groups or one-on-one interviews, collecting feedback from the business community takes longer. And I'm also suggesting that it probably should be ongoing. I don't think it's just like, get business feedback, write a poll, go out and poll. Oh, we've got, 50 or 66%, great. I think it needs to be ongoing throughout this whole process.
So maybe if we split up the small, medium, large into phases, we did kind of a round of business outreach. And then at the time we were doing more detailed polling, when we had narrowed in on things, we would do like a second phase.
Pass that back. I mean,
I think the more important question is the point that the vice mayor made earlier, which is we don't really have anything structured for them to react to yet.
yeah.
So I don't feel like we can start that. It's helpful that we're getting questions, for example, like, what are you doing and how much is it? Like, we don't know
Yeah.
the answers. We don't even have ranges yet.
I know I had,
Well, I think we do have ranges.
well, but it's pretty broad. I mean, I had somebody come up to me over the weekend at a private school here, and they said, like, I heard that I'm going to have to pay for Cubberly. And I was like, no, we kind of kick that
Maybe,
off and move.
but not-
Well,
not-
but
not
not with this one. That's not what we're considering, right? And they were kind of like freaking out about that. And
I think we've been pretty clear about that.
I thought we had too, but this business owner had not gotten that message.
Well, to be fair, if you don't read all the way through the staff report, I can understand how people would be like, there's a lot of needs.
So, I mean, if we look at these questions on page 33, again, I think we're in position to ask very similar questions about the potential taxes we're considering, right? So is it fair for businesses to contribute funding by paying a business tax? Is the tax based on number of employees fair? We could ask about square footage.
I don't know that asking questions about, fairness is as helpful as saying, like, the sort of the next level, like, how would it affect your business if, you had to pay $150 per employee
Yeah.
every year?
Right.
What if, and then equity questions that are more about maybe the exemption, that's possible. There are industries that interact that we're not aware of, right?
Yep.
Right, where if we exempt
Sure,
one,
I
it might
think-
be a
I think asking, are there others that you would make sense, but I think if you start, again, we would let the consultant write the research questions, right? If you start to throw out a specific dollar number, then it's like, well, what is the benefit I get back?
Yeah.
And again, I think if we think of phasing this, we're just not at that phase
So-
yet.
So I think Chair Du Bois is right. There are some good starter questions in here. The one that kind of struck me as not terribly helpful, actually, though, was the, like, what do you think the money should be spent on? A lot of it's like, build more parking garages, don't do road diets, more parking garages, potholes. And I actually think this is a more systemic problem that even we here on this committee and on council, we've said, oh, maybe we want to spend on transportation or affordable housing. We don't know our spending priorities. I would love to hear information from the business community. Just respectfully, some of those answers were not that helpful, right?
Well, I mean, here's another, like, so page 35, does knowing that small businesses would be exempt make you more favorable? Well, what is our definition of small businesses?
It was
Right,
10
we need
employees
to
or
know.
less for this survey.
Yeah, but is that what we want to use?
We should decide.
So I think the questions that the committee is struggling with are valid, and I think it's indicative of where we're at in this process. We do have some limits in the sense of the further analysis is to be based on 1 to 10% of the general fund. So we can ask questions based on what would 1% revenue generating versus 20 million revenue generating, thoughts, feelings, where's the tipping point kind of thing. I think if the committee provides general direction of what would be helpful in this narrowing phase, then the consultant who does this for a living, whoever they may be, can really help us identify the right questions to be asking those businesses. I think things like narrowing out the would you fund a TMA is perhaps not necessarily germane to this conversation, and I think staff know to filter through based on the lens that we're looking at. Ideas like exemptions and unforeseen impacts are good concepts that staff can go back with the consultant and weave into whatever outreach we do. Administrability of the tax, I think, is also a good one to ask the businesses. However, I do think they will be limited in their ability to answer because they don't know how complex it is. So, broad strokes of what's easier to administer as a business, a headcount, a payroll, a square footage, sure, that might be something that they're more able to answer at a broad level, but the specificity of, this tier or a small business or, if we phase it or tier it by X, Y, or Z, it doesn't sound like we're there yet if we wanted to complete that kind of outreach at this moment in time.
A couple other ideas based on what you just said, Kylie. I think asking them if they're paying city business taxes in other locations and, how they administer that could be interesting. So if it's a larger company with, multiple offices. And then I think if we talk about using this tax to fund transportation, housing, and potentially some general fund services, we could ask them a trade-off type of question, like, say you had $100, how would you allocate it to these 5 or 6 items? I mean, similar to, again, some of these polls where we had a list of items, I think we could come up with a similar question and actually get feedback from them on how they would allocate them on those.
And I think as you think about specific examples like that to articulate a larger concept, those larger concepts are really helpful to us in going back and working with the consultants. So for example, part of what I heard in the discussion is this isn't the same as a poll of voters. So questions that are not necessarily trying to get at what would it take for you to be favorable to this, and more, what would the impact be on you, so that we can make an educated decision about that is what part of what we're hearing from the committee. So that's helpful guidance to help the consultant focus on this is less about how do you feel and more about what's the impact, and so that we can figure out where we draw lines.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that I think trade-off questions are a really excellent way to get some information.
We got that one. Yes, thank you.
Just 2 more things, and sorry, I know we're just spitballing here. Another one I'd love to hear about is kind of like competitivity. Like, would this cause you to reduce business activity or raise your prices, right? Like, I saw there's one in here, the little creamery, right? Like, do they increase the cost of yogurt because of this business tax? And the other one, I would just ask the chair if we do have one expert here on Palo's business community, if our representative from the Chamber of Commerce, and I'm just wondering if we should ask former Mayor Kleinberg about any ideas about this stakeholder group and how we may do that successfully. Understood, you're maybe not terribly supportive of this whole effort, but if you have ideas, I'm serious, like if you have ideas about how we should conduct focus groups and stakeholder work with the business community here.
Yeah, I noticed you right late. Did you want to speak to the committee, or? What's that?
Is that okay? Yeah. Thank you.
And we would presume coordinating with the chamber as part of the outreach as well.
Yeah, Judith Kleinberg. I'm sorry, I'm sick, and that's why I won't get too close to that in case anybody gets close to it. Well, first of all, thank you for even thinking about talking to the business community, because it's taken 3 years to get to this point. As far as how you would approach talking to the business community, focus groups are only good up to a point. You're going to leave out an enormous number of businesses that have very strong opinions about this, and it can be spotty. I'm not sure that focus groups are always the most reliable way to go, but it's better than nothing, obviously. I think the most important thing to businesses, because they are business people, is specificity. And I know that you've heard some of the comments that we've made at other meetings here and also tonight, that business wants to know what are you planning to do and where are you going to spend the money. And the comment about Coverly, by the way, it is in a staff report. We didn't dream it up. It's in a staff report. So, but the point is, we hope that something that you're going to spend the money on will be an improvement of the community in the way that improves the business climate. So if you're going it that way, in other words, you're talking to the business community about what can improve the business climate, then you're going down something that they can respond to. If you're talking about something so nebulous and so vague as the term transportation, housing, by the way, I don't know where you'd put it, but okay. I mean, the business community will just react with not much information. It won't be very helpful to you. The more specific you are, the more specific the responses will be, and the more helpful it will be to you in terms of evaluating impact. Spending priorities are very critical. I mean, you've got to think about this, and I know I'm lecturing to you, but I don't mean to. I'm not feeling too good. Businesses always think about spending priorities. That's what they do in business. And so if you don't come to them with some ideas about what those are, and I understand Councilmember Du Bois just tonight added the phrase general fund purposes. What are those? So business will say, well, I'm not in the business of just funding your general fund. I mean, in other words, you're going to get a negative reaction to those kinds of questions, and so that doesn't really help you. I think if you were, and I know it's very hard to be specific at this point, but when you talk about future needs, those are going to be vague. The more specific you can be, the better. In other words, the business community is going to look at you as a business, and they're going to evaluate the way that you go about this the way they would in business. In other words, where are you going? What is the plan? What is the work? What is it going to cost you to administer it, enforce it? What's your data set? Where are you getting the data from? What's the flexibility in the data as things evolve over the years? And so, I think my best advice is to go at this as a business plan that you're pitching to business. And otherwise, business will not react very well, be very frustrated, happy you've asked, but frustrated in giving you anything that's valuable. We certainly will help with outreach. I think the very most important thing is for you to do your homework, and I don't mean that as a criticism. You're trying to do it right now, so that's good. And the staff is being amazing, because this is hard work, no question. I think that if you take the time to be more specific before you do the outreach to the business community, you will have a better outcome in terms of valuable information coming back to you. As long as I'm up here and I've got the microphone, I will say that there are two things that the business community is very concerned about in terms of this business tax. One is that it be a general tax. And obviously, that's not something the business community would support at all. A specific tax that actually improves the business climate, and that there's some relationship between the tax and the community building for a business climate, which is the community quality of life. That would be something that business would be reacting much more favorably to, and maybe not have a big fight. So a collaboration around what that special tax would look like, how it would be implemented, how it would be complied with, that sort of thing. And the other is where you're going to get your data, because even businesses don't have much data. It's very, very hard to pin that down. So did I even answer your question?
That was helpful.
Okay.
I mean, I think just focusing or reflecting for my colleagues, a few things that are helpful there is one, one question or set of questions maybe, if, part of this tax could be to support the business community and the business climate in Palo Alto, what does that look like to you? What would you invest in? That may be helpful. That was one thing that stood out to me.
So I do think we can get fairly specific, and again, looking at page 18, slides 30, 31, I think there's some good stuff here that we could actually go ask. So things like traffic congestion on local streets, I think we can ask about rail separation, parking, TMA, affordable housing, maintaining the city's core infrastructure.
Sorry, are you still on asking the businesses or?
Yeah.
Okay.
So again, like some question about, business tax, how would you, allocate a business tax among, 5 to 10 items? And I think a lot of them are transportation and parking related. I think we should ask about affordable housing. There were things on here like safe sidewalks, paths and bridges for pedestrians, accessibility for people with disabilities, shuttle system. I think we could easily come up with a level of detail and get some feedback on kind of where the most interest is.
I mean, I don't want to be like a wet blanket, but like, that almost sounds like, hey, businesses, we've got these ideas to tax you and spend it on this stuff. Like, which ones do you like the most? And like, pick the least bad thing here.
I mean, we've done a lot of polling, and transportation and housing have always ranked really high. And if we want
Among
to break that down
residents.
into another level of detail, right?
Right, and these questions were for residents, right? And so
Yep.
I think there's a different lens for the business community.
I think the open-ended question about, what are things that would help your business? And we can be specific about saying in the transportation area, are there other areas? I think open-ended questions, I get nervous when we give a really long list because sometimes we've left things off and sometimes, the other category might not be something. So, obviously these people have done this before, so an open-ended question and then they can follow up in the other categories seems like a way to elicit these things.
But don't you think we should kind of do both, though? Kind of to the point of, well, what are you going to spend the money on? I think having a range of options that show the kinds of programs we're thinking of.
I mean, I think the representatives of business have been abundantly clear. If it's a specific tax, then we have to say what it's on, and they'll support that. And if it's a general tax, then, then we're gonna have more flexibility. I don't know how asking them the long list is helpful.
Well,
I'm not suggesting this long.
Right,
just
but
to
we
be
could,
clear, but-
this is where like the idea of scenarios comes in, right? Like we could say, hey, we are looking at $100 per head count tax, and we're gonna exempt businesses under 20 people, and everybody else has to pay it. And it's early, but we're roughly thinking of spending 50% of it on the grade separation project, 30% on traffic congestion, reducing traffic congestion, and 20% on affordable housing. What are your reactions? I think that's where like scenarios are good, and we don't necessarily have to indicate general or specific in that scenario, but that's like something a business may be able to react to.
Yeah, I'm gonna go up one level from that and say like, would this be more beneficial to your business if it included funds for affordable housing, right? That's a yes or no question. I think that's something that'd be kind of interesting to know from their perspective. I mean, there's not a lot of disagreement that I'm aware of that transportation is, a big issue. I think so that's the thing that I would like to hear from the business community. Would this be helpful to your business if we added in this? And what are two things if we spent the money on transportation you'd like us to see? I don't know. We probably shouldn't keep going at this level of detail since we
Right.
haven't gotten.
It's not so much the
polling yet.
level of detail, but I think we've had some different ideas which are good. Like, I think you're going to more open-ended probing, the idea of scenarios, the idea of trade-offs. I do think we need to be careful how we ask scenarios to say that these aren't actual proposals, right? And I think you need to craft scenarios in a particular way if you really want to scientifically extract data from them.
I'm just wondering for my colleagues, like, you know, we've thought of this idea of like focus groups and maybe some stakeholder engagement, working with the chamber. Are there other like circles or avenues you can think of to like, reach businesses?
Well, so my
I'm-
understanding is this research is not focus groups, it's individual interviews.
Interviews, okay.
Because people are much less willing to share
Okay.
in a group.
So I'm just wondering if you guys know of any other ways of, you know, reaching businesses here in Palo Alto. I think one of the challenges I see here, and this will eventually feed into our, you know, administrability stuff, is like, if you go to a place like Blue Bottle Coffee, I mean, that's all like businesses going on in Palo Alto, right? But I doubt we have a door we can knock on. So I don't know, I'm just wondering if you guys have any ideas on reaching or accessing different business types here.
I think we give the screener to the consultant, right? You sort of specify the types you want and you pay them to go reach those companies.
Yeah, but I think part of our secret sauce is it's not just, you know, somebody can come in here and go, you know, find the businesses in Palo Alto that have a storefront. I don't think that actually captures the full gamut we have here. I don't know.
We also have the business registry.
And to your, what I think I'm hearing from you, Councilmember Fine, is as we are thinking through how we engage with stakeholders in the business community, be broad in what we're looking at, meaning let's coordinate with any resources that we have, coordinate with the chamber, coordinate and look at our business registry to make sure that as we're going through, we're not just walking the street to identify a storefront, but really trying to make sure that we have, as the consultant would be developing this plan, is really looking at how best and far-reaching we can get in this.
And we would be looking not only at storefronts, but at the research park, with the leadership group in terms of any member companies that have a presence in Palo Alto, et cetera. So we'd look at several different doorways that way.
I was going to add also geographic distribution. I think we tend to be very focused on downtown here, and there are other places that people have businesses. Another option is thinking about new businesses, right? All the ones who've applied for permits or built something in the past year, surely we actually have that information and know how to contact them. They might be particularly interesting, people who've recently made the decision to open a business here. I think that would be a category of people we'd like to hear from.
So should we, does staff feel like they have enough direction that they can, so again, I'm in favor of you bring this to council, and I think because it is a long lead, we should start, and again, get back to the question of phasing, if we need to budget it, do we do kind of an early phase and then a more detailed phase?
It sounded to me like there was a lot of support for a couple of rounds of outreach to business when you all talked about it being ongoing and you don't want to forego early feedback, but you recognize that we don't have a lot of decisions made to ask for feedback on yet. So it sounds like we would need to do a couple of rounds, and we would need to budget for that.
Or manage the budget to do a couple of rounds. Which is
So
a little
maybe-
bit different, like you do smaller phases, but you do 2 phases.
Maybe the first round questions are more the things about what the money could be used for, and the second round questions then are more maybe around like exemptions and rates and things like that we'd have more information on.
Yeah, I think in the same way that.
I know, I was just thinking two-step, general and then specific,
Yeah,
but
and-
I don't.
And in the same way that
It's not a
Mr.
pun, but yeah.
Yeah, in the same way that he has described to you how we would do that with resident polling, I'm sure our consultant who would be handling the outreach might have some recommendations as well on how to divide that up.
Okay, so should we move forward to E, or is it, yeah, E, I think, talking about the consumer polling? So I think kind of similar feedback. I think Mr. Metz knows how to do this, but really focusing on some more of the high level concepts. Like, I'm not sure residents are really going to want to be getting to the details of the specific type of tax, and I don't think we're ready to, but maybe some questions about kind of the level of taxation, potential exemptions, and the same kind of questions about allocating it. And I do think we need to be a little more specific in terms of potential transportation changes, the transportation, affordable housing programs. And then again, when I said general fund services, I was thinking of things like, maintaining the city's infrastructure beyond just the traffic angle. Some of these example polls seem good, and something we could pretty much move forward with something similar to council.
I would also note that we did the polling for the city of Mountain View when they put together their business tax at last election cycle and followed a similar structure. We did 2 polls for them. They were also looking at a marijuana tax and a potential TOT at the same time. But we wrestled on their behalf with a number of questions about tiers and rates, things which may seem a little obscure to the average voter, which obviously matter a great deal to businesses and to the city in terms of the revenue they raise and the impact they have. And we may have some model questions that we used in that polling which might be helpful to bring over here, and we can look at, review that and see if there might be some things that would be helpful to include.
Okay. I love this topic. Can I just ask a few top-level questions? So still looking at like 400, is that still like the number that seems appropriate?
That is sort of the minimum threshold that we try to clear. That's what gets you a margin of error of under 5%. In the surveys that we did for you in 2018, for the first time, we blended phone and online interviewing.
That was my next question that I
Yes.
really, really wanted to understand.
Yes.
And which phones?
Yeah, landline and wireless,
Okay.
mostly wireless.
Okay.
And we would recommend using that same approach now. It is simply impossible to get a good representative sample. It is utterly impossible if you're relying on landline phones. If you're relying on
Even I
telephones
don't answer
only,
my landline phone anymore.
yeah. And even I don't, and I'm a pollster. Except in the vain hope I'm going to get polled. But I think also, particularly in communities like this one, where obviously there is a very healthy use of a variety of different communications technologies by your residents, we want to try to reach people as many different ways as we can. I think in 2018 that the data proved to be a pretty accurate read of where the public was, and so I'd recommend we repeat that methodology. We were, in 2018, we actually ended up getting far more responses than we had planned for because the public was so responsive to the email interviewing, which allowed us to boost our sample sizes at no additional cost. That may or may not be the case again here, but we may, if we plan for
What
400.
about text? I think text now is what email was then.
Yeah, text is another mechanism of driving people to an online survey. We wouldn't recommend having people trying to survey people via text. This is a little too complex for that to work.
Okay.
It may also be that to the extent, and this may be more true for the second survey than the first, if we end up having 2 or 3 competing models that you want to test with the public, we may want to treat them as
Larger.
independent
Yep.
samples.
Yep. Okay.
So, we'd have one group of 300 where we test one model and then compare them side by side.
That sounds very promising. Okay, great, thanks. I just wanted that overall part. I agree with Chair Du Bois that the 2016 poll looks frankly quite comparable to what we would be contemplating now. I was struck by the idea that voting yes on it was so strongly correlated with the perception of the city's overall need. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on ways that we or other cities have managed to convey that.
Yep.
What are things that work, that
Yeah.
help move that needle?
So usually when voters are deciding whether or not to vote yes on a revenue measure, there's 3 factors they consider. The first is the money going to something that they think is a demonstrable need? Second is the funding mechanism reasonable and fair? And third is, do they trust the agency that's asking for the money to spend it appropriately? It is the first of those 3 that is probably the most essential condition.
Okay.
If voters believe that there is a pressing need, they're willing to take a risk on the second 2 questions. If they don't see a pressing need, then they're unlikely to want to tax themselves. And so I think repeating some of those questions about perceived need to see whether it has grown over time. I will say Bay Area-wide, what we've seen is as concern about housing costs, traffic congestion, and homelessness has skyrocketed. And at a time when regionally the economy has been fairly strong, voters' willingness to recognize need and say they're willing to tax themselves to pay for it has been higher in general than what we've seen in the past. In terms of what the city can do about it, really, up until the point where you vote to place a measure on the ballot, you are free to do non-advocacy, public education, and communication, acquainting your residents with what the city is raising and spending, how that matches up with what policy and policymakers and planners have identified as the city's needs and where those shortfalls are. It can be really helpful for the public to understand that before they get asked to vote on a measure like this. And so I would encourage you, particularly if the first poll comes back and shows that there is not a great awareness of the need, you know, a secondary step there may be to do some public communications where you try to let the public know what the shortfall is.
That's extraordinarily helpful, Mr. Metz. And it brings up two things. One, I've been harping on with the rail work, is that we haven't really done a very good job explaining to the community why we have to do this. So I'm concerned listening to this and thinking about what maybe this is something the XCAP can work on. And then the second, I think, falls squarely within Ms. Nosey's area of expertise, which is explaining what we spend the money on, where we get our money and what we spend it on. So I don't know if that's something that we can include in the work plan, perhaps when you come back to council, but this is a really important point. And while we all spend all this time on the details, these are two big picture things that we should be thinking about really hard. Okay, thank you for that. Do you find, so I saw the swing voter tended to be an older population in 2016. Are you still seeing that? Or was that kind of unique to this time and place?
It varies from community to community, and it really depends on what we're asking them to put money to. Let me just see if I can get those in front of me.
Page number.
You know, it actually was a bit of a mix, to be honest. This was, it's on page 13, slide 20. Some of the oldest voters are more in the middle, but so are some of the youngest voters as well. You'll see voters 18 to 29 and under 50 are on that list as well. It's really sort of middle-aged voters, those aged 50 to 64, that are more decided and actually tend to be more positive. It is less age than it is the other factors you see here, which is partisanship, number one. Anytime you're talking about raising taxes, Democrats tend to be for it, Republicans are more skeptical, independents somewhere in the middle. And then younger voters, by and large, particularly younger Democrats, do tend to be more enthusiastic, as are more affluent voters. And voters with more limited income tend to be a little bit more in the middle. And obviously here in Palo Alto, you have quite a spread when it comes to socioeconomic status.
Okay, I just, having done this and having had to get the swing people to vote for a tax, I was relentlessly focused on that. So that category of information when we get the poll is extraordinarily helpful.
And just to note,
yeah.
that will probably be something that we'll explore more in the second poll.
Yeah. And I should have said absolutely. I think that the two-step process makes a ton of sense. I worry, I will just be honest with you, that the number of things we have for the first poll is overwhelming. Even just listening to you describe them, I was like, that's a long list. And then we have to explain pretty much all of them. They're not things that your
Intuitive,
normal
yeah.
person, uses on a day-to-day basis. So, I mean, in order, the type of taxation, I think that's something that can be explained and should be, and we should get a sense of people think whether it's, done on these various levels of taxation. I'm not sure, is that we'd be asking about $100 versus $300 versus whatever per employee. I don't know, that might be in the second round, maybe, as opposed to the first round, or?
I think it might be useful to, for a lot of these questions, things like, for example, who should be exempted. Voters will have some instincts about who they
Yes.
feel some sympathy for or don't want to burden with taxes. Obviously.
And we should also be asking a question is, do you think it's fair that, that everyone pays the same regardless, right? We
Right.
need both of those data
Sure.
points to compare and
Yeah.
contrast.
Things like what the rate is, per square foot. Your average
Later.
voter is going to have very little context for offering an opinion on that. On some of these questions, we may ask them and find that we either have large numbers of voters who say they don't have an opinion, don't know, or we may find that, varying something like square footage, for example, the rate per square foot, there's just no meaningful difference in the way that voters react. And at that point, obviously, you need to factor all the other things into consideration, the opinion of the business community, from a public policy perspective and a revenue generation perspective, what the implications are. public opinion is only one input. It's obviously an important one since they're the ultimate decision makers. But you should look at this poll as not determinative, but as one input into your decision-making process.
If I could
And
jump
then-
in there,
yeah,
I just
sure.
wanted to point out this slide. So on page 9, you had kind of a general language about a head tax, and I could see doing something similar
Yeah,
for square footage.
all three of them, I
Yeah.
think, we should do a little, they're gonna have to describe them for for people to be able to make an informed decision. And then I think the other two things that should certainly be in there, which you already covered, one is, and I think it's usually phrased in the terms of, would you be more likely to vote for this tax if the revenue were dedicated to blah, 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 which is getting at specific versus general. I think that's gonna be very insightful. And then the other part is, testing, which naturally you would do. Would you like all of the proceeds to be dedicated to transportation? Would you be more or less likely to vote for it if some portion was available for affordable housing? And then, the open-ended question. Those are the things that the big decisions, separate from the mechanism that we choose, the big decisions about whether it's specific or general, and what exactly the funds are for, those are the ones that I'm really hoping to get some early direction on. And anyway, it's wonderful to be working with you again. Look forward to seeing this.
So I'll just jump in. Yeah, I see most of these kind of context questions. We need to continue them. We'll see where the needle is moved or not. There's one area that's missing that I think may have changed a little bit from 2016 and 2018 to today. Well, actually, maybe two areas. So one that I've harped on a little bit is, do we think we're coming into a recession? And I would love to get some kind of data on that. Do you think recession is coming? Would that affect you voting for a business tax, right? I wonder if Palo Altans will react differently if in 2020, we're in a recessionary period and something's changed. Another one that kind of came up last year on the hotel tax, our colleague Councilmember Tanaka really argued for a specific tax, saying the city has a history of doing these general taxes and then going back on the funds. And I remember having a sidebar with him at some point. I'm like, oh, we're not going to do that. And then, come this year, we end up putting the downtown garage on hold. And I frankly apologize to some of the hoteliers because I feel bad about that. I think that was irresponsible. And, sorry? I'm not supportive of the garage. We're not going to get into that, though. And I wonder if there is something to the third point you meant about how voters evaluate these things. Does the community trust the council with more money? And that might get a little bit at the magnitude, right? And you were asking, you're not quite sure how do we get at the magnitude of this tax? Like, do people understand $100 a head? Is it, 10 cents a square foot? And maybe that's where we do use this metric we've used a little bit, like, the general fund is $230 million. Do you, support increasing it by 1%, 2%, 5%?
Can I jump right in?
Yeah.
I think that's.
Is that dangerous, you think?
I think that's too much to ask of your average person who doesn't sit here, week in and week out. I think it might be easier to understand if you say it would raise $5 million. It might raise, if it raised $5 million in a year, and that would fund, and explain what that would pay for.
Yeah,
I think that might be a little bit easier. I mean, 20 minutes is a long time, and you have to ask, would you be much more likely, slightly more likely, somewhat more likely? These are tough to go through.
Okay.
One other wrinkle I should note on this point, generally when we're thinking about how to describe the sort of aggregate fiscal impact, we sort of defer to the way it ultimately is presented to voters on the ballot. And under current state law, it requires that you have to say what the tax rate is, what duration it will be in place for, and how much revenue it will raise on an annual basis, right in the ballot question. So that metric is probably the best way to approach it.
Okay.
However, there is a bill on the governor's desk right now, which he is, the rumor mill is that he is considering signing at least, which would change the requirements for ballot language to describe bond measures and taxes that have multiple tiers, like the taxes you're considering. Because obviously under that law, you can't describe all the different tiers and all the impacts they would have in a 75-word ballot statement. So cities are left to, there's no real way of complying. What the law says is that under those conditions, it would simply say, see voter guide for tax rate information, and then you could spell it out in great detail in the voter pamphlet. that could be a very consequential difference in the way the ballot language reads and the way that people react. I believe he has to make a decision on that bill within the next 2 weeks. So I think we'll know the answer by the time we're polling. But an awareness of that may also inform the way that we think about some of these
Thank you.
questions.
So that actually makes sense. Like if we're going to propose certain ballot language, we use those same kind of pointers in the questions. Just one other thing, Councilmember Cormack brought up the issue of like, do voters understand all the issues we may spend money on, for example, rail grade separations. I also wonder about that, and I would even challenge, can we be specific about that? I don't know if we've been specific about it ourselves, and if that may help with this polling. Is it, $5 million, including some money to bicycle boulevards, or is it $5 million to increase the Palo Alto shuttle, or is it for rail grade separations? That money may not go very far on that endeavor. So I do think this maybe it's tonight, maybe it's our next meeting, we need to be more specific about if we have a menu of things we'd like to spend on, or the council would, we should start putting that together.
So a couple thoughts. I mean, so I do think we made a promise on the TOT, and we should get the downtown garage moving again. In terms of, I think, the comments you guys have said about this, so again, I think what I'm hearing is, starting out very similar to these polls where we ask questions about the city overall. I think some of those questions about the type of tax in a very general way. I do think, the work plan here is from 1 to 10%. I think our general fund's 265, something like that, 230. So I think we could ask about a tax in the range of 3 to 23 or whatever $1 billion a year. There'd probably be some value in that. Similar questions about exemptions, retail, restaurant, hotel. And then I do think on the consumer side, we should have a little bit more of a list of specific transportation programs. So that list I read off before, I don't know if you guys caught it, but it was a subset of the ones we asked in the past. There was, I guess one question I have, and I don't know if cities do this, do cities ever poll on using funds to pay for unfunded pension liabilities?
I can tell you that were you to ask the voters their level of enthusiasm for that as expenditure plan for a new tax, it would probably not rate that highly. Yeah. There have been cities where we've tested that along with other items. And
did you do it specifically for police and fire?
I can't recall whether we've asked it specifically in that context, but.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I thought. And because you did Mountain View so recently, is there anything else in that polling, especially the exploratory stage, that you think would be useful?
No, I think most of what we found in our work for them has sort of been reflected in our discussion here tonight. They had a lot of complexity in their rate structure, and we just decided to set a lot of that aside in terms of asking voters about it. It was much more conversation they had with the business community. And then most of the other aspects that we sort of thought about in designing those polls are exactly the concerns you all have been putting your fingers on.
So I think if I heard Councilmember Cormack right, I think you were saying we could ask a question not only about exemptions, but also about almost complexity, like what if we had no exemptions, or it was kind of a simple tax? Were you saying something like that?
I think there are some people who, understandably, and, some of us may be part of them, are like, simpler is better. Would you prefer that everyone pays it? I think there are probably some people who would feel that, exempting people will look like people are picking winners and losers, and that may not seem fair to some people.
So
And I think, I think there's some, it would be helpful to get a read on that just at a general level, right? Traditionally in Palo Alto, we try to be very detailed and specific, right? And the thing that concerns me in this particular instance is that I don't know that everything is knowable, and I worry about some of the choices we might make,
Well,
so,
I think the
yeah.
previous business tax that actually went to the voters was very complicated, and that was
Yeah.
part of the reason it didn't
Yeah.
pass.
One thing you may think about is it can be helpful to ask questions that force a choice about the trade-offs, as you were all talking about when it came to the business outreach, as opposed to asking people about these options individually. You know, I could see in a survey 90% of voters agreeing that all businesses should, pay something, and then 90% also agreeing that sole proprietors should be exempted. If we ask about those as independent things, whereas if we say you have to choose which of these two is your preference, that forces them to weigh it and evaluate it a little more thoughtfully. And so there may be some places where we want to think about forcing the difficult trade-offs that you all will face in structuring this and putting those before voters.
Actually, I had a question, since you brought that up, this page 16, slide 26. I don't know if it was meant to be a trade-off. It was kind of a interesting comparison of different things. I'm looking at this one.
Oh, let me see here.
Yeah, different, it's,
Ah, gotcha. Got it. Yes.
so one sounds like a specific tax requiring funding be used for transportation. I don't know if you remember this, or it just seemed like an interesting mix of things to compare.
Yeah, this was, we weren't forcing choices between these items, but these were a number of, potential policy elements that were under consideration there were sort of odds and ends that I think we lumped into a single question.
Okay. But yeah, I'm a strong supporter of trade-offs.
Yeah.
I think it's a great way
I mean,
to force people.
For example, you can look at the last one, and as I remember, we had a lot of discussion about this. Voters were split on the notion of how they felt about charging $100 per employee each year for each employee above 50, which sort of begs the question, is that because they believe we're asking too much or because we're asking too little? And so thinking about questions which would make those distinctions a little clearer, which I think in this survey, where we're going to take a little more time to sort of probe each of these structural elements a little bit more, we can avoid some of that ambiguity.
Just one more. I think most of this committee's agreed that if we want to and need to do a business tax, we're going to do it irrespective of other ballot measures. But I'm wondering if we want some kind of knowledge about, is there anything about like wavering support with other measures on the ballot? And so I'm just wondering, if voters know that there's, faster Bay Area and there's potentially a split roll, does that change how they would vote for
Yeah.
this? And can we get at that?
Or do we do that in the next round? We had a specific language.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, what we find is that if there are state and regional and local measures on the same ballot, if anything, the local measure is likely to take support away from the regional and the state measures, simply because voters are more likely to vote for a tax that they know will benefit them locally, as opposed to one that puts money in a larger pool, which may or may not filter down to them. At the same time, I believe $100 million has been pledged to fight the split roll measure at the state level. I wouldn't anticipate that level of opposition to the Bay Area regional measure, but it does mean that the airwaves would be full of a lot of anti-tax messaging and sort of raising skepticism about government spending. And so I think the place to test it would be in the second poll, where we're looking at the pro and con messages. Let people know a little bit about the political environment in which all of this will be happening, and potentially the cumulative impact of taxes on business if all these measures pass, and see how they react to that information.
Okay, that might be helpful.
That actually brings up another timing thing. I mean, last time we went through this and it worked, we had our last poll way more in the spring. I mean, I feel like it was May or so, and then the council decided in June. So even if we stick with this work plan, we're gonna need to do it, and it might be at that, whatever that hypothetical third time is next year, sort of towards the latter part of the first half of the year, that we'd introduce that. Also, keep in mind the split roll one is called Schools and Communities First. I'll just let you know the official name of that. Can I just tag on, were you done with the transportation stuff, or, I mean, we were talking about like maybe being more specific.
Yeah, so I think we're really talking about E and F together, right? And so,
Well, you had that really long list that you read from the time before. I actually think we should maybe collapse them a little bit into transportation, infrastructure, and services, and then, talk about grade separation as train crossings, if we could please use train crossings as the language, just easier for people to understand. And then services we've already talked about include the Transportation Management Agency, which we actually need to explain, right? Giving, low or no cost public transportation passes to employees who work in the community. And then, shuttle buses. And then I think after that, I don't know how much agreement we have on what else is on the list. So if
again,
that's,
I guess I would look to staff. Again, I think there's quite a few programs that could potentially be. I think we hit the big ones. And
again, if we structure it as transportation, infrastructure, and services, that I think captures things and doesn't get us into a laundry list of sidewalks and stuff like that.
but I think people may be interested in bikes, right? So bike
I mean,
and ped probably needs to show.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm wondering, is like
Isn't that
people,
already funded, though?
not forever, not all of it.
No.
I worry a little bit about transportation infrastructure and services, like, we at this level break those things down. I wonder if voters do. And I mean, that's why I was saying things like, more shuttles, bike lanes, better sidewalks. That's typically the kind of language you see in these ballot measures anyways.
Yeah.
But I just don't know if that's very helpful. And so I wonder, I mean, I'm almost wishing like I had my CIP book with me right now. We can go look and I don't know. I'm just at a little bit of a
We don't have
loss
to call it
here.
infrastructure, we can call it projects, right?
Yeah,
Which are
I'm just-
transportation construction projects.
Yeah, but then people are going to think, like, look at the business community's feedback. They're like, oh, more parking garages. I mean, is that the message we want to send?
I don't know, we've been really consistent. Grade separation, TMA, transit for residents, transit for people who live here, you can figure out how you wanna describe that.
I would just.
Are you saying you wanna go further, or you wanna add in like parking programs?
No.
and-
I just don't think we've actually been that specific.
The three of us have been.
Out of curiosity, the one that I'm not sure I can tell where it's falling is affordable housing or housing in general. Where would that fall within those categories? Because the direction right now that we have from the council and committee is that the revenue proceeds would be allocated to transportation and or housing, with the splits to be determined at a later date. So in terms of transportation, infrastructure, and services.
I think the affordable housing one is pretty straightforward. We're just looking to put it in the city's affordable housing fund. We don't know if it's 20% of the tax measure, 50%, whatever. And we can determine that later. The transportation is the one where I have some.
Affordable housing
Question.
for me is still a question about whether or not the polling suggests that people find the tax more or less palatable if it's included. I'm also interested in what the business community has to say about whether or not that would be beneficial to them. And that actually goes back to what you said about Councilmember Tanaka, right? And a point I made early on that, like, in some ways, from a transparency standpoint, a specific tax that says here is what it will go for, solves that question.
I know, absolutely. And I'm just like, I'm thinking of that if we decide on a specific tax. We could say 30% of this will go to the city's affordable housing fund. That's pretty specific to be used in affordable housing projects. 70% will go to transportation, including, is it the city shuttles, mobility for residents, potholes, and I'm just asking us to be a little more developed on that transportation bucket.
Well, I'm sure staff can do that. We have a very long
think we have
list
a
of
good
things.
list, yeah. So do you guys feel like you have what you need from this, and you can come back to council with a specific proposal?
So what I guess the question is, it would be at the committee's discretion. Depending on agendas, we would be wanting to look at the October 21st or the October 28th meeting in order to meet this timeline. And if we were to bring back all this feedback summarized as we discussed earlier this evening to the committee on October 15th, and the committee unanimously approved it, it could go on consent, and then council would have the discretion of pulling it off of consent or not.
No, I think something like this, why doesn't go on consent even if we all vote for it?
So you guys would want it on action.
Yeah.
no matter
And
what.
so I thought you were saying you weren't even gonna bring it back to us, you would just bring it back to council?
We could do either.
Yeah, so like, why don't we spend our time getting the data and looking at the types of taxes and working on that?
Sure.
That saves you a step, right?
It does save us a step, absolutely. No, because technically they're not supposed to.
Oh, that's right. We would like to bring it back to you just so that you can vote to send it to council.
Yes.
Because we're not agendized to set that up tonight. But we wouldn't expect any discussion on it if it just reflects tonight's.
But I guess take the feedback.
You have
and
to
be-
remind us about that when the time comes.
Yes.
You know, I'm
I'll do that.
anticipating to take this feedback and be very specific, like we're gonna do this contract, we're gonna do this polling.
Ideally, yes. What as Michelle had just outlined, since tonight technically we can't really take the direction specifically to council, what staff would do is probably provide at least a summary of all of this at the 15th that the committee would quickly review and thumbs up it. And then my guess would be at the full council, we would have the contract amounts, the budget amendments, and any further refinements between the committee meeting and
But
the
like,
full council.
would it also show like potential poll questions and the plan for the business outreach?
I would, from this feedback, I would say that it will not have all of that. From this feedback, it'll have the general parameters and allow staff and the consultants to work on the specifics.
Yeah, okay.
If the committee wants that, I would say that's specific direction and would probably
No,
change the
I
timeframe.
I think as I was saying, it needs to be after you get the budget approvals, right? So,
And the last time we did this, the full council got into a conversation around at the questions level on the second round of polling, but not the first. Because that first round is high level enough that the consultant's judgment will probably drive the content for the most part, without a lot of council direction.
I'd just like to offer that I certainly know at least one of our colleagues will be interested in seeing some of the questions in detail. So I know it hasn't been traditional for us to do it that way, and it probably has some,
if we haven't
Does
hired
it-
the polling company yet, how do we do that?
I was just gonna say it probably, I'm just speaking more generally, right? It probably has, we may not wanna compromise the poll by providing if maybe. I'm just thinking out loud about
Yeah.
how to accommodate the concerns, frankly, that were raised in a prior time, and thinking about not wanting to sort of like share all the information and bias people who might get the poll, and you can
Right.
help us think through that.
Yeah, I would say, obviously, we welcome input from you and all your colleagues in terms of the construction of the questionnaire. As you can understand, line editing a document in a public session with 7 people and trying to maintain
We do that every Monday night, just in
Yeah.
case you wondered.
can be challenging. A way that the other cities that we've worked with have sometimes handled this is to get direction from council about what they want included, supply a draft of the questionnaire to all members of the council in advance of a meeting, ask for their feedback to staff in advance, which means they have a chance to review, provide feedback, but we don't necessarily have to edit it on the spot with the group. So I defer to you and staff about the best way to handle it, but that might be a compromise.
I just think staff should consider it based on prior experience, and
Noted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So I think, future meetings and agendas,
do we need to approve the revised work plan? Would you like us to vote on it?
do you need that?
So I move we approve the revised work plan.
Second, all in favor? So I think we had a question about moving a meeting.
Correct. So a couple of things. Future meetings, the next meeting is October 15th. And right now, we would be bringing this item back and then a much meatier item, which would be pension policies. In terms of bringing and synthesizing all of this, that information would technically go out and packet on this Thursday, but I'm not quite sure how fast I can turn this around in the sense of getting a memo out in the next 2 days. So I suspect October 15th packet, since it's 2 items, will go out next week, just for the committee's awareness, and given that time frame. To the chair's point of the November date, currently we are scheduled to have a meeting on November 5th and November 19th. I am concerned, to be honest, about being able to meet the November 5th timeline and deadlines. That's when we were planning to bring back the refined revenue estimates. Since we don't have data at this point, staff is only able to do so much. So what I would like, if the committee is willing to, is looking at potentially delaying that meeting to the following week. We've looked at the calendars with the clerk's office. There's a PNS meeting on the 12th, so that doesn't work. The 13th could be an option. And then the 14th is a human services, I can't remember the full name.
HRC?
HRC, thank you, Human Relations Committee. So really that week it would need to be Wednesday the 13th. There's also a PTC meeting on the 13th, however, since that occurs in chambers.
There's also a UAC workshop that evening.
Ah,
13th.
Yep,
that one I did not have on my calendar.
yep,
Where's that?
at Mitchell Park, starting at 7 p.m.
That's why.
Sorry, why is the 14th not an option?
HRC?
Do
But is
we-
any of us on the HRC? Oh, you are,
Are you?
aren't you?
I can go, I would go to finance over that.
Or, I mean, what about just the 19th?
I mean, the 14th, we could meet in chambers. We've done that before. Or vice versa.
Sure. We can look with the clerk's office in terms of scheduling it on the 14th in terms of splitting the rooms from that perspective. In answer to your question, Councilmember Fine, on the 19th has CAFR and all of our year-end financial audits that
So
we're striving
we're
towards.
keeping the 19th.
Yeah,
Okay.
so we would need to keep the 19th, and so realistically, depending on when we get data, you may see staff toggling those items. We may have
Okay.
to accelerate CAFR and pull back ballots depending on when data comes in. But pulling all the meetings as far back in November as possible without hitting the Thanksgiving holiday is helpful, given
Sorry,
the
what was the problem with the 12th?
policy and services.
And the clerk has to staff these meetings, so
Oh, I get it now, sorry.
it's
I
not
was
just
missing
room
that.
availability, it's staff availability.
Finance, I mean, sorry,
Correct, yes.
That's the 13th.
However, there's a UAC meeting on the 13th.
So I think can everybody make the 14th?
UAC would be on the first Wednesday of the month.
Yeah,
They've
there's a-
scheduled a special workshop.
Oh, they did it on the 13th.
Do you have it showing up on your calendar? Well, I hesitate to ask
So
if
the
it's on our
preference-
calendar.
Preference would be the 14th.
Fine with
If
me.
we had to do it the 13th.
14th
Yes.
works.
Miss the UAC.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
14th works.
So 14th would be the preference, the 13th would be second runner-up.
Pending our research on the UAC.
yes, and it's at 5:30 again?
We're saying if for some reason the 14th doesn't work, we could miss the UAC thing.
Understood.
Okay, we're
So
canceling the 5th.
We will be
We're
canceling the
tentatively
5th
putting it on the 14th.
or the 13th.
14th, 13th may be later. That's the Community Foundation's regional meeting in the afternoon. I don't know if anybody's got
Yes,
that.
so we will,
Start at 6.
yeah, we'll strive for the 14th. If the 14th doesn't work, the
The
fallback.
14th at 6.
The 14th, we could do 5:30. If we go to the
Correct.
13th, we would do 6.
Correct.
Would you like to send us an email?
We will.
Why don't you do that?
Yep, but as long as the committee knows, 5th would be canceled, let's push it back to one of those 2 dates, and we'll coordinate the specifics.
And keep the 19th. Okay, got it.
Yeah, we need to talk with the clerk about it anyway, but as long as you can make those dates work.
Yes.
Okay, I
Thank
think with
you.
that, meeting adjourned. Thank you.